Hello, everybody, and welcome to another MyMusic. Today, I'm going to be speaking to newly nicknamed Nick the Potter Haeffner. He's laughing because he didn't know I was going to say that, but it's because he's just told me that apparently his surname means Potter, which is, do you know Harry?
No, I don't.
No. I don't know. I'm thinking about it. I know one Harry, but it's not the Harry that has Potter after his name. We will be talking to Nick about sort of where his music came from, the new album, and all sorts of things straight after this.
Keep on, don't stop. Keep on, don't stop. Keep on, don't stop.
Nick, thanks for joining me today. Now,
Thanks
it's nice.
Yep,
It's nice because before we started this, we had a little chat, and you said to me that you've done a few of these recently, and that some went off in one direction, some went off in another direction, and then you realised that there were bits and pieces of your life that, or the background to where your music's come from, etc., that you hadn't kind of brought out in some of the conversations you'd had. So you've been writing some notes. So my first question to you is, as you've started writing these notes, how many pages are you up to now? About four or five pages?
About 4 pages, and I'm still thinking of things I should have put on that. Yeah.
Okay, so as you started doing that, has the temptation come across you at all to think, I might actually write a book about this, or pamphlet, or?
Actually, pretty much exactly that. Yeah. I'd often thought, well, I don't think there's enough there of interest to people. I think probably one of the things about, my music life is that it's probably far more interesting to other people from all the other people I've worked with and come into contact with. Who, I can give you a long list of people who are much, much better known than I am. And often when I talk to people, they are picking up on that and wanting to ask me about, what was it like working with Hugh Cornwall from the Stranglers or something like that. I'm thinking, well, actually not very good, and that was a very short-lived thing. It wasn't a great success. But so I mean, I have come into contact with lots of people who will be of interest. So if I did write a book or something like that, I would think it would be relatively short. But the thing is that hardly anybody has heard of me. Very, very few people, I think. I've got around a bit during my life, and it's been quite an interesting kind of musical life.
Well, look, Nick, the way I look at it is like you. I mean, I've interacted along the journey with people that people have heard of. I'm pretty certain that most of the people that people have heard of who I have interacted with probably won't remember me.
Yeah.
Partly because they may have been enjoying life at the time. Let's put it that way. So I'm pretty certain it may have been all of a blur for them. But I think these days people are actually interested in anybody else's life. I think it's very healthy in a way to try and look at other people's lives and the journeys that they have and just try and see what it teaches us about our own journey and our own life. So I think do it, my friend. If you're inclined to do it, I think do it, because ultimately I think there will probably be more in there than you expect there to be that will actually be of interest to other people. And sometimes, I'm going to say this as well, sometimes actually when you get books from somebody that's been around other musicians who are famous or whatever, but hasn't necessarily had that kind of career themselves. There's an element in which people feel like they are getting more of an authentic view, because let's face it, especially these days, I bet half the autobiographies that are coming out at the moment from pop stars and famous musicians probably aren't even written by them. Oh, what did I say?
Yeah. Well, I've still to read Jar Wobble's autobiography, but Brian of Dimple Discs tells me I've got to read it, and it's great and it's extremely funny. So I definitely will. You
know what? When you meet him, as I did the other day, you realise just how funny he is. he don't stop talking, and it's great.
Yeah.
I just think I just love to see him in a film with someone like Vinnie Jones or something. Do you know what I mean? I think it could be hilarious. Absolutely hilarious. So, when out of those 4 pages that you started writing, was there an immediate sort of story that you thought, I haven't told this yet that I really want to tell?
Well, I don't know. I mean, when I was talking to Pedro the other day, I was thinking, okay, so it is a little bit like psychotherapy sometimes. And actually, Pedro was very, very reticent. He didn't talk very much at all, but, good. Sometimes, people will try and draw you out of yourself and prompt you and things like that. And I'm thinking what you do in psychotherapy, which can be therapeutic, is trying to construct a story. And what I've been trying to do in my life is trying to get my life straight, because it just goes off in so many different directions. I think maybe even with somebody, if you're talking to somebody like Jar Wobble, there's probably been a certain consistency about ploughing a furrow. And with me, I think the difficulty is it's like a tree. It just keeps going off in all sorts of different directions. And so it's a little bit difficult for me to try and pull that together for people. And the worst question somebody asks me is, what's your music like? And it's usually the first question they ask me. And actually, people probably just think I'm being really vague. But if someone else is with me who knows my music, they say, that's really difficult. I don't know. And I think the reason from that is that it's been fed by so many different things going into it, and then it comes out in all sorts of different ways, and people I meet, and I love working with other people, and I'm just very, very kind of broad-minded, and when a chance comes up to work with somebody, other people might just say, oh, that's not for me, or something like that. And for me, it's always an adventure. It's always about doing something new. So anyway, I suppose the thing that I started off with Pedro, that I suddenly started to think maybe did tell us something a little bit about my music, is the first musical memory he asked me about.
Yeah.
Now, I was born in Australia to parents who were living over there for 4 years, English parents who came back to England.
Yep.
And we brought back with us, which my dad would have bought, a record of sheep-shearing songs. And it was
sheep-shearing songs.
Yeah, sheep-shearing songs.
Right.
Well, essentially Australian folk songs, but it's the songs that the guys who
listen to while you shear. Yeah. Right. You sang while shearing.
So they used to sing while they were. So the main song was called "Click Go the Shears Boys," I love it. It's a song that they used to sing while they were shearing the sheep, the thing I suppose that I got from that was that I'm very susceptible to musical earworms, and a chorus from a song or something like that just goes round and round in my head, and I can't get rid of it. It's really obsessive.
Yeah.
And that record was the first instance of that. And I talked a little bit to Pedro about folk music and what that means, and it probably means a bit less to me than it does to Kelsey in terms of traditional music and place. And what I think folk music has always been for me is the kind of song that embeds itself in your head and that everybody gets hold of and picks up on. So for me, folk music is closer to something like pop in a way, really.
Yeah.
It's a song that can become fantastically popular because it just embeds itself in your brain, and it's quite simple. It's quite simple to play, and other people can pick it up and play it and sing it and that kind of thing. So that record of songs was my first kind of contact with the kind of songs that melody, tunefulness, infectiousness, and something that I thought brought people together and could be shared by everyone and all that kind of thing. And that was all very appealing to me, and that's kind of all stayed with my music. And the great tragedy for me is that, you know, my music kind of remains something that is not widely known or shared or that kind of thing. But I've always really wanted it to be. Yeah, so my dad's musical kind of influence, I suppose, was fairly early on, and I suppose it shaped me until about my late teens. And he was basically, I suppose, a civil servant for quite a his life. He's a bit of a grey man. He was a little bit serious, very kind, quite creative, but a bit frustrated because he didn't really have time to do much creative stuff. Taught himself to play the violin in his spare time, was pretty good at that. And rather serious, read a great deal, always encouraged me to read, quite open-minded. And so he was very into folk, because I think he sort of took that quite seriously, something quite authentic. And he also loved classical music, and he encouraged me to be interested in what was going on at the time in the arts, in music. And that was in the 60s. That was very experimental music. That was very avant-garde music. And he actually, as a kid, he bought me a sampler. And that's another thing that's played a huge influence on my life, is sampler records, where you get these different types of music all strung together. And he bought me a sampler record of what we call music concrete now, just abstract electronic sounds. And that was John Cage and other people. And I would listen to that as a kid, a very precocious kid. And then I had older brothers and sisters. My brother was 10 years older than me, and they had not a huge record collection, but it's quite quality stuff. They had the Beatles' White Album, Abbey Road, Legion Leaf by the Fairport Convention, Incredible String Band, Leonard Cohen, Led Zeppelin. So I was exposed to all this by the time I was about 8 or 9, I think. And I used to buy singles, and I bought Eleanor Rigby and Help. And there was what was the song that had Mary Hopkin? Those Were the Days, I think. And lots of other stuff like that. And I just used to play those to death over and over again, like a kid who wants to hear the same story told over and over again. And people around me must have really suffered, but that's what I did. You know, I just used to play them over and over again because the tunes just stuck in my head. And I can remember those records really well. And because my older brothers and sisters took music a bit more seriously than I did, and they got a bit fed up with me buying middle of the road chirpy cheap or something like that when I was a kid. My older sister, who's a very kind person, very interesting, she took me out to what was Tower Records in the centre of London, and they had earphones where you could listen to albums. And she said, buy an album. You know, stop buying singles, buy an album and find something you like the sound of. So I went around listening to stuff on the headphones, and I picked an album by Melanie, 70s singer-songwriter, called Candles in the Rain. I've still got it. I gave it a play the other day. I think it's a great record, actually. And it starts with a long track with the Edwin Hawkins singers. And I realized that gospel music's always been something I've loved. And she brought together 3 things that I think are in my music at the moment, which is kind of wanting to capture some kind of soulfulness that moves people. Something that is, she often just performed solo with an acoustic guitar and was called a folkie, but she was influenced by much more than that. And she did quite quirky songs, like she had that huge hit with Brand New Key. And those 3 things have probably kind of stayed with me. You know, just wanting to be able my songs to stand up just by me singing with an acoustic guitar, something that's connected to folk, something that I hope is kind of soulful and moving to people, and something that's quite quirky. And then that was 1970. I was 9, and I told Pedro this, but I went into FOP Records in the centre of London, and I bought the re-released Roxy Music box set a couple of years ago, first Roxy Music album. And I took it up to the guy in the counter, and I said, I bought this when it came out. And he gave me a look, and he said, no, you didn't. that's impossible. And I went back home and I thought, and it was 1972 and I was 11, and I think I did buy it when it came out, or maybe the year after. So I was kind of 11 or 12, and that was pretty far out kind of stuff. And so, yeah, I was very precocious. I was mad about music, completely obsessed with it. And I loved hearing things that challenged me and that were new. I sometimes say to people, if they say psychedelic, I just think, well, it's mind expanding. It's like having your mind open to the point that it becomes crazy, you know. And I think some of just loving new sounds and different sounds has to do with that. And then my sister took me to my first gig, which was in 1972. So I was 11 then, and it was because Melanie was headlining, and I'd become crazy about Melanie. But because I was 11, she figured like I was starting to, she wasn't sure about keeping me out that late. So we didn't get to see Melanie, but we got to see the Beach Boys and Shana Na, who were on the same bill. 50.
Now, were the Beach Boys any good?
I don't remember the Beach Boys all that well. Right. I mean, I think I knew Sloop John B as another one of those earworm tracks, and I think I probably had played that a million times by the time I was 11. But I have to say that the Beach Boys didn't make a massive impression on me at that point, and I'm not sure who they were or who was in the lineup or what they were like in 1972. But
it's quite interesting because I'm reading the Derek Sherman book at the moment, because I'm going to be speaking to him later in the week, and
great, yeah,
there's a chapter in there where he mentions seeing the Beach Boys playing live together for the first time, and really disappointing because most of them didn't really know how to play their instruments, and kind of the myth was, the bubble was burst, if you know what I mean.
And I wasn't suddenly, the clouds didn't suddenly open and an array of light came down and say, oh wow, this is the Beach Boys, it's genius, you know. It didn't happen that. And I got, you know, didn't start taking the Beach Boys seriously musically till a lot later. And then,
I just got to say there, by the way, just in case, I don't think he was, I mean, he's a massive fan actually of some of the songs that they wrote, but it was just at that moment, it didn't come together. What he saw with them, and I think he still thinks that, well, he had actually other part of the book, he still quotes Brian Wilson's God Only Knows as one of the most perfect songs. So, you know, there's often a disconnect between, you know, what someone writes, maybe a performance, whatever, you know, that they don't necessarily come together, do they?
No, and I mean, I think, you know, the history of music is kind of littered with people who at the time people didn't get it and didn't show much enthusiasm for. And the comparison I started to get, we'll get to this, but, you know, when I finally got to release my first album, and some people were, you know, the press for that was amazing, fantastic, and the sales for it were, to me, kind of deeply disappointing. And I got compared to Nick Drake quite a lot when that first album came out. And one or two people said to me, yeah, you know, they said your big career mistake was not dying after you released that album. They said, if you'd done that, you know, you'd be a legend by now. You know, but that was your big career mistake. So, you know, and it is a bit strange. And I was reading about a Nick Drake gig, and I think somebody was talking about their experience of going to a Nick Drake gig, and they said that he played and he was supporting somebody, and there weren't that many people in the audience, and there was very sporadic applause, and people weren't very enthusiastic about it at all. So yeah, I mean that does kind of relate to my own kind of experience with my music, is that, you know, quite a lot of the time I feel like it's not getting much response at all, but subsequently it gets kind of hailed as something rather special, you know. And
well, so what you're saying now, I mean, and that's a common thing, which is that the enigma of someone, and let's remember as well, you come out of a music time when actually Enigma, etc., was far more important in a way. I mean, I think actually for young musicians coming through now, there has been a massive shift towards, in general, I'm going to say, towards someone being very relatable and someone being very much more authentic, and actually people want to know their stars now, right? Whereas, you know, in the past, if there was a mystique around you as an artist, that could be very profitable for you, right? And with someone like Nick Drake, there was almost a kind of mystique around Nick Drake, which...
Well, I think that's true, and I forget who it was. I think it was probably Nick Egan from the T-Set, who I was in the band with, and he recently had a documentary made about him. He does artwork, music, and videos for very, very famous people. And I think he said at one point, you know, that he'd come out of seeing somebody on a huge stage in a sort of stadium, and then the next week gone to see a punk band in a pub. And the difference between that, and that's something I absolutely kind of lived through. And another thing that puzzles me slightly, but, you know, people do quite often describe my music as prog. And that there was a period in my life when I listened to all the prog bands and went to see quite a lot of them live, but that was relatively short, and it was all kind of blown away by pub rock. And I would say that pub rock had a much more important influence on my life than prog did. But maybe I was listening to some of the same things that the prog bands were listening to, and I would certainly say that a band like Caravan or something like that has still a big influence on my music, and they're considered very prog now. And another review of my new album came out yesterday, and it compared it to Canterbury-scene, Robert Wyatt and Kevin Ayres and that kind of thing. I can see all that. But
cool. Well, I've got another comparison that I'm going to let you into a bit later. I'll keep it under wraps for the minute.
All right. Okay. Yeah.
All right. And it'll probably shock you because it's probably, but it's not prog. I promise you.
All right.
It's not prog.
Yeah.
But now look, I'm interested. Do you know what? I quite often interject, but I was really taken with your stories there. I can see a lot of similarities between. I mean, you've had more musical success than I have, but I can see a lot of similarities between the two of us in terms of how our lives panned out with various things, and I can completely and utterly relate to you. So this is why you should tell your story, sir, because I feel like it's very, very kind of relatable, and I think there's a lot in there. Going back to the dad thing, I've got a question for you out of that, which is, so I feel for any of us of a certain age, we try and avoid, as we grow up, we try and avoid becoming like our fathers. But how much do you feel now, retrospectively, looking back, you've actually become your dad?
Oh, well, there's a real therapist question. I don't know. I do ask myself that sometimes. I mean, I didn't get on at all well with him for most of my teens and quite a lot of my childhood. In my childhood, he was very distant. His job took him away from home quite a bit. He's still not quite sure whether it was the job or him, but we moved around quite a bit, and I always had to go to new schools and make new friends and things like that. And that's part of my thing now. It's not exactly a superpower, but you know, I get on very quickly and easily with new people, regardless of their background. You know, and that was something I cultivated partly because I had to do it. So how much have I become like him? I got on much better with him in later life. He left his job as a civil servant. He became a lot more kind of open, liberal. Do
you think you understood your dad more as you got older?
I think so. I think there's something a bit about him that's a bit of an enigma. He was, you know, I found that I used to do a lot of the talking with him, and that I used to talk at him because I sort of had him pegged as, you know, it must have been a bit tough. He was born in 1926, something like that. And he was living through the 60s, and the 60s seemed to him to be the death of a lot of the things that he cherished, you know, and he saw himself as kind of very civilized person, and was a very civilized person, and couldn't deal with all the kind of anarchy and the craziness and all that kind of stuff. He was very, very kind. And I think I probably am pretty kind person, but I don't know if it's done me a lot of good. You know, you get tagged with the thing of nice guys always finish last, and kind of that kind of thing. Yeah, you know, the kind of nice guy tag hasn't really done me a lot of favors, I think, but it does mean to say that I get on reasonably well with everybody. And yeah, he got much more open-minded as he got older about different things. Yeah, he did have a great curiosity, but my mum is the joker in the pack. I mean, my mum was a very intense person. She was just, my dad was very intelligent. My mum was just as intelligent as my dad, but she had to be a housewife. She was fiercely independent thinker, very, very opinionated, and very anti-establishment. She came from a rather establishment family and hated everything to do with that. But she was from an older generation. She couldn't really fit in with the 60s. But yeah, she was quite rebellious. And yes, there was an academic strain in my family. And I think I said to my mum, you know, I don't want to be an academic. I don't want to do anything to do with that. She said, I want to be a pop star. She said, that's great. She said, I love that. You know, so. But then again, she was quite mentally ill, you know, quite seriously mentally ill. And I lived with her for a long time, between 14 and 26. My parents broke up when I was 14. I lived with her all that time, and she doted on me, but she was completely crazy. And she used to throw furniture down the stairs, and she had crazy delusions and things like that. So the question of how much I'm like my mum, I don't really know. Yeah. I developed a bit of a dislike of people who are really dramatic.
Yeah. That makes total sense. I mean, this part of your life now, where you're, and it seems like these interviews that you've started doing are actually sort of making you think even further about your life and where you've come from. But this record's partly that as well, isn't it? I mean, the record itself is called "What Time Can Do," right? So,
yeah, it's constantly kind of. But you know, you said this when you're talking to Kelsey, and I totally agree with this. Is totally where I'm coming from, and the reason why I get on really well with Brian, and probably why I'm talking to you now, and everything else, is that I believe really profoundly in that idea of trying to embrace, you know, the new and change and be in the moment that we're actually in, not be some stupid nostalgia person, you know, but trying to actually live in the times we live in. And also I believe very profoundly in the resources of tradition, and trying to tend those and keep folding them back into what I'm doing now. And you know, I definitely, I worked in a record shop for many years. I didn't talk about that with Pedro, but that's a really important thing. I worked for Our Price Records, the chain. Lovely. And they used to move me around all the time. You know, they had this policy. They didn't like people getting too settled, because they thought they would just end up handing free records out to people over the counter, their mates and things. So they used to move you around to all the different areas, and they moved me all around Hertfordshire, and then they moved me to the West End, and then moved me a little bit around London, and they stuck me in a warehouse in Kew for about a year or two. Don't know quite what punishment I'd done for that. Wow. But during all those years, I was with people who we'd all play each other stuff, and we all thought we were a bit connoisseurs of music. And some of the people who'd been there for longer loved all the sort of the little out of the way corners of music, and would introduce each other to more obscure stuff. And I had at one point this ambition. I was going to move through every section in the shop, so that I knew stuff from every section, because it was all sectioned by genre. And there were weird things I learned about music. There was a guy who was an area manager who I didn't like all that much, and he was, but he'd come in and he was very business minded, and he'd say, "Okay, we're opening up this vast new shop," and he said it's going to be really, really upmarket. And he said, "Shall I tell you how upmarket it's going to be?" And I said, "Go on, tell me how upmarket it's going to be." And he said, "We're going to have 200 blues albums." And I thought, okay, so music made by the poorest black people in America is going to be your marker of how upmarket this is. And I thought, well, there's something interesting to think about.
Well, I think I think when you think about it, it's fairly obvious, isn't it, that sometimes, from a sort of cultural game point of view, that people who have the least amount of time to invest in finding will gravitate towards something that they are told makes them look like they're educated in something. Right. And so in a way, but also it's, I guess it's going to be always be to some extent go along with that whatever the most culturally relevant thing to talk about at the time, right? I mean, you may find that with sort of various elements of jazz, for example. Jazz has always had the same sort of thing, you know. I mean, and you think about some of the sort of Paul Whitehouse experience type jokes around jazz.
I've been watching some of those sketches.
From that period of sort of like the 90s, where it's like, hey, folks, it's jazz. And it's so, you know, but the reason being is because it becomes then the language of a particular clique of people. Right? They don't actually know anything about it at all, but it's like, oh yeah, I've got that in my collection, and I buy that, and oh that's the Miles Davis album that, you know, I should have, right? You go in there, they're probably never gonna have some of the more obscure 70s Miles Davis albums in there. Probably not.
Well, I think I guess jazz has overtaken blues a long way. And, you know, I was trying to do this in my kind of taking stock, that when I was coming into my teens, well, basically through the late 60s and early 70s, blues remained absolutely the thing that musicians aspired towards, and it was blues rock based. You know, music was blues rock based. That was it on the whole, and everything else kind of existed on the sidelines of that. And I went through a whole period with, when I learned the guitar, of not wanting to make blues, not wanting to play blues lead guitar. And that's gone on for a long time. And I'm just starting to try and explore that a bit and get into that right now. But for a long time, I wanted to avoid that as a marker that would differentiate me from all the people who came before. And I was talking to Pedro. He said, what was the first guitarist you were influenced by? And I said, well, I don't know, maybe somebody like Richard Thompson. And then the other day I read Fairport Convention. And the other day I read that some fans talking about Richard Thompson's guitar playing. He said, who's the better guitar player on Facebook? You know, Richard Thompson or Eric Clapton? And one person said, there is Richard Thompson is not a blues guitarist at all. And one of the things that's most interesting about his music is how little he plays like a blues guitarist. And I think that's probably one of the things that drew me to his music, you know, and drew me to folk music. And part of that also, you talked about authenticity, and I guess part of that also was reacting against the cultural dominance of America and just feeling that I wanted to make more English music. And what was I doing, trying to sound like somebody who came from the Mississippi Delta or something like that? And so things like Caravan, I loved that. And if people said my music very English, well, maybe there's two things there. One is that I refuse to sing in an American accent, and I still wince slightly, whoever it is, if it's Bowie, you know, or whoever, I still wince slightly at people singing in an American accent. if they're English. And I liked the way that the Canterbury people just kind of enunciated rather clearly, where Jagger and everybody else was just trying to drawl and slur as much as they could. If you're Tom Waits, that's fine, you know, but all those people who just try and drawl and make the words as indistinct as possible.
Well, there's none of that on this album.
No, I kind of took pride in the idea, you know, okay, I'm going to enunciate and that's going to mark me out a bit, you know.
Yeah. Let's talk about the album. Right. So 11 tracks, some really interesting titles. Apparently it's all Maggie Thatcher's fault. Apparently, you know, other prime ministers are available for questioning. But yeah, great title. Now, what I'm going to say is, the thing that I'm going to liken it to, that probably nobody else is going to tell you this, so hopefully this is good, is I immediately thought of early Prefab Sprout.
Yeah, okay, so somebody said that I went to play in Dublin, courtesy of Brian's you know, ever vigilant attempts to, you know, help me along, and his contacts and everything. So I went there and I supported Eaton, who's on the label, and there was a lovely big crowd of people, and I think it went down pretty well. And I think Irish people probably generally a very good audience for my kind of music. And somebody came up afterwards and they said, I really like your voice, you sound like Paddy McAloon. And I thought, well, I haven't heard that before, but you know, why not? It's not a million miles away. I did have a Prefab Sprout phase. Again, they had those kind of fantastic earworm songs. And maybe also underneath that Prefab Sprout were one of the early bands to use pretty advanced chord changes in their music. You know, for indie music, the chord changes going on underneath what he was singing. And I think my kind of chord changes that I work with are probably closer to kind of Prefab Sprout than to some of the other kind of indie music.
Yeah, I think there's a sophistication there. I think the fact that you've got, you know, that harmonica sound in there as well, with the kind of, you know, widened harmonica sound, that was quite prevalent in sort of swoon days of, you know, or early days of Prefab Sprout as well. I think it's the fact that it's intelligent lyrics as well, mixed with a kind of folky poppiness. I think there are elements in there that are kind of Prefab Sprouty, and I don't think that's a bad place.
I think that whole kind of era of indie pop I feel quite close to, although I think they're probably on a major label for most of their career. I did a Kitchen Wow when they originally or something, but yeah, you know, I mean, I still love things like Aztec Camera and Everything But the Girl and all that kind of stuff like that. And
Martin
they were very
Stevenson and the Dainties, you know. I mean, I think there were some great bands around at that time that had that kind of, you know, it was more than pop. It was more than pop. It had the folk element to it. It drew from proper storytelling, but definitely wanted, and it definitely wanted that melodic earworm in there as well. I think it's one of the reasons why famously sort of Thomas Dolby ended up working with Prefab Sprout is to kind of help that earworm bit along, make it more radio catchy, ear wormy, you know.
Yeah, and you know, I mean, I think any of my stuff's ever been played much on the radio, and you know, that surprised me and disappoints me a little bit, because I make songs that I hope people will want to kind of whistle along to and all the rest of that. But yeah, so the album, it's all Maggie Thatcher's fault. That's, you know, we can start with that, because there's been a few reviews have come out just the last sort of week or 2 weeks ago from blogs and things like that, and I've been a bit surprised because people just immediately assume the song is me singing about myself, and I avoided writing like that probably the whole time I've been making music. I, if you do lyric writing or songwriting, if you get any advice from people about that, they'll say, well, one of the things you can do that may make it more interesting and maybe more effective for you is to write from the point of view of a character. And that's mostly what I do. Most of my songs are written from the point of view of a character who's not me. And so Maggie Thatcher is somebody who grew up in the time that I did and went through the 80s like I did, and had friends who were appalled by Maggie Thatcher and began to feel that their world was completely falling apart because it was being very aggressively dismantled. And also, all the kind of institutions that they liked were being attacked and things like that. I just remember having that conversation with people, and we'd be having the conversation in the pub after a couple of pints where we'd be putting the world to rights. And afterwards, I remember somebody once saying to me after we'd slagged off Thatcher for an hour or two, he said, yeah, it's all Maggie Thatcher's fault, isn't it? Which is to say that it's not all Maggie Thatcher's fault. You can't just put it all back down to that. So I just wrote the point of view from a song of a character who's a little bit crazy, for whom every single thing in their life has become Margaret Thatcher's fault as they get older. So that
it's a lived, it's a lived through experience, but it's not necessarily your viewpoint.
It's something I can relate to, And then there's kind of sci-fi in my music, so there's that comes and goes. It's not consistently going through these, but every now and then I write a song that's got a kind of sci-fi thing, and it takes place in the kind of alternative, slightly futuristic world. And there's a song on there called Back in the Life, and that's a kind of slightly sci-fi kind of scenario. It's someone who falls in love with an avatar inside a game online, but it's in this rather dystopian world where that's dangerous, people finding out, and so it's probably a little bit difficult if you just come to the album cold and you don't know anything about it. And somebody I think was writing a review where they were thinking that I was sort of talking about my life in that song, and it's something very, very long way from that indeed. And the first track is about a house guest we've got, is a young gay Italian guy, and he came to London to see the life and have lots of friends with benefits, as he calls them, and things like this, but actually got trapped into doing jobs that were, he'd often, when he first came, he was working for 3 or 4 different employers, and they were all 0 hours contracts, and people would just phone him or text him, and they'd tell him the hours that they wanted him to come in and work. And sometimes these were in the middle of the night. He was somebody who had very, very strong dreams and aspirations, a very imaginative kind of person. So it was really about how your time can be stolen from you. And the key line in that song is from a poem by Langston Hughes, which is what happens to a dream deferred. And it's the idea that all your dreams have to be put on hold while you have to give your time to somebody else for the money. And that's what that song's about.
So the thing is, for anybody that's coming to, you see, I don't get that. For anybody that's coming to any album, why would they should put assumptions to the floor, really, and just enjoy or not enjoy the album for the sake of what's there in front of them, And
people don't need to know those things, and I'm kind of interested to see what people make of them. When I do it live, I usually kind of introduce the songs and I say a little bit about. And obviously my live shows I've been doing quite a lot lately, thanks to Brian, but they're not reaching a lot of people. But if the people that knew the album were coming to see me live, then they would kind of hear that. But what I think also, sound and what I call the sonics of what I do have always been a really, really big important part of it. So I like very structured songs. I like chord changes that are interesting but satisfying. I like chord changes that have a little bit, take you somewhere into some unexpected place that's a little bit mysterious. George Harrison used to do that a lot. There's certain types of chords that he used to augmented and suspended and diminished chords and things like that, and they sometimes came from gospel. But what they would do is they would kind of defer the resolution by taking it into some area that in a lot of Western music isn't quite expected, and so you'd be taken out into some other place. And I try and do that with the chords, and then I try and make the choruses and the melodies quite kind of earwormy and that kind of thing, and then it's all embedded in this kind of production where there's quite a lot of treatment to the sound, to the sounds that are coming in. There's a lot of reverb that kind of fell out of fashion in the post-rock era, and among people who had jazz chops and things like that. They wanted everything to be very dry. And I remember the band that I was in, the Tea Set, I had a big fight with some of the people we worked with Hugh Cornwell. Actually, Hugh Cornwell was dead into this. He wanted everything dry as a bone, and I was just obsessed with music that was just absolutely slathered in reverb, and that we just completely didn't agree with that. And so yeah, I use a lot of kind of reverb and delay and things like that, and I love the idea that it's this kind of bath that you get into that's kind of full of all these kind of infinite reverberations and things and sounds that are, yeah, the sound that you referred to, actually, it's produced from that being like a harmonica. It's actually a melodica, which they use in reggae music a lot, that you play with now. But very often on the album, it's double tracked with a mellotron flute.
Right.
So what you get is this sound that is something like something that you've heard before, but it's probably not like anything you've heard before, because it's actually two things that are mixed together.
Interesting.
So it's full of sounds that I hope kind of are pleasant to listen to, but they're actually they've taken a little bit of a turn, and sometimes a little bit strange and weird and unexpected. And I hope that the album kind of swims in a lot of that kind of atmosphere. And sometimes I had to do a gig and somebody just gave me their guitar and stuck me in front of the mic. And I found it difficult getting through the set because it was all dry. And without any kind of atmosphere and kind of echoing and things like that, the music just didn't quite come out. It's a bit like sticking the Cocteau Twins in a kind of completely dry kind of environment. It's just not the Cocteau Twins anymore.
It certainly isn't. Well, listen, Nick, thank you so much for coming to talk today. Let's hope some people go swimming through this album with you.
Yeah.
I mean, it is. It is sonically very, very rich, and I hope that people do appreciate it for what it is. I think it's going to be interesting, people listening back to this now, getting to know a little bit about you, where you come from, a little bit about your personality as well. And I think hopefully it's done its job, which is that people get intrigued enough to go and listen to the record. That's why we don't ever play anything on this show. We try and bring the story, let people make that connection with people. Then they go, oh, I wonder what that does actually sound like. That sounds interesting. I'll go and investigate it. That's how good music always used to be found. Right?
Well, that's true, and I hope that maybe people listen to it more than once, because I think now there's tendency just to play a little bit of a snatch of something online, and
20 seconds.
Some apps will only let you play 20 seconds, and then you decide whether you like it or not. But in the old days, we used to buy an album and we say, "What do you think of it?" And you say, "Well, I haven't got into it yet," and that meant that you expected that you would have to give it another 10 plays. And I think you probably, if you play my album 10 times, you probably start getting quite, it probably start getting under your skin a bit and into your head. But just listening to a snatch of it, I'm not sure how much you get. Yeah.
It's like all music. You do need to actually invest, and the difference these days is that because you don't have to invest, because you can literally like talk to something like that in the corner of the room and it play you 20 seconds. You're not investing. You're not actually physically investing anything in it, in the process of that or whatever. You haven't saved up for it. We used to save up, literally spend our pocket money on that, not that. And then you had to make that work. You had to put in the effort. You had to broaden your listening. You had to, make your ears grow, as it were, over years.
And music now is quite niche, and so often I go and see a band and all the songs are in a very, very similar style, very similar sonic kind of register. But I will say, I'm a bit more optimistic in one way, because wherever I've played to an audience where there's people in their 20s and 30s, sometimes they're super enthusiastic about it. And I think some of the music that I make may strike people who are a bit older, if they've lived through punk, as something, particularly if they were very enthusiastic about punk, it may sound like what they wanted to sweep out of the room when punk came along. Very, very produced, very kind of singer-songwriter kind of approach often, things like that. And a lot of that just got completely swept out. Some people are still happy that went, who are older, but younger people have gone back to music from the early 70s that's very manicured, very produced, very skillful,
I think part
crafted,
of it is
and they love it.
I think part of that is because some of their artists that they're following, current artists that they're following, have done the same, and they're beginning to realize that there's, to have the longevity in their career, they need to move out of this just cyclical music that they're making. So, but thank you so much for today.
And thank you, Graham. Thanks for giving me the time to talk. Yeah,
that's all right. This has been the wonderful Nick Haeffner. He's been here today to talk about his new album, which is now available
on Dimple Discs.
On Dimple Discs. It's called What Time Can Do. Make your, stubble grow and your wrinkles around your eyes, but also a beautiful album as well. So do check it out, folks. And we will be back soon with more of the same. But until then, if you've enjoyed this, please do go and share it with other people. Bye for now.
Thank you, Graham. Bye now.